My sister told me to stop eating because I hadn't contributed a penny to the dinner sitting in front of our whole family. She didn't know I owned the house we were sitting in, or that I'd been quietly paying for everything, including her. There is a particular kind of quiet that lives in a kitchen right before a family dinner, and I have loved it my whole life. Not silence, exactly, more like a held breath. The oven ticking as it comes up to temperature. Fat rendering low and slow in a pan. The soft knock of a wooden spoon against the side of a pot. That evening, standing at my sister Bianca's stove with a dish towel thrown over my shoulder, I was in the middle of exactly that quiet, whisking a pan gravy the way our father taught me, and I remember thinking that everything, for once, felt almost right. I had been back in town for 6 months. 6 months of learning the new geography of my old life, which grocery store had moved, which neighbors had died, which streets flooded when it rained hard. 6 months of driving across town 3 or 4 times a week to check on our mother, Rosa, who was 72 and stubborn and getting frailer in ways she refused to name out loud. I had left a life in another city to come do this. Not because anyone asked. Because someone had to, and I was the one without a husband or children to explain my absences to. So when Bianca announced she was hosting a proper family dinner, her words, always her words, everything with Bianca had to be proper, I said yes before she finished the sentence. And I offered to cook. Of course I offered to cook. Cooking is the one language my family has never argued in. I'm a chef, or I was, or I am again depending on the season. For years, I built supply chains for restaurant groups, the invisible machinery that gets 40 pounds of duck breast to a kitchen at the right temperature on the right morning at the right price. Then contracts dried up the way contracts do, and I'd been living lean, taking private cooking gigs, consulting where I could. My family knew the lean part. They did not know the rest of it. That's important and we'll get there. That night I made a standing rib roast because Rosa loves it and rarely gets it anymore. I made roasted root vegetables with thyme from the little pot on Bianca's windowsill, thyme I had planted actually on a visit in the spring. I made the gravy. I made a green bean thing our father used to make. I made a trifle, layered in a glass bowl so it looked like stained glass, and I brought the wine. Bianca floated through the kitchen in a cream-colored blouse that I know cost more than my monthly car payment, touching nothing, lifting a lid here, wrinkling her nose there. "Is that going to be heavy?" she asked, about the gravy. Marcus is watching his cholesterol. Marcus, her husband, was in the living room watching a game with the sound up too loud, watching nothing about his cholesterol as far as I could tell. "It's fine," I said. "There's plenty." There is always plenty. That is the whole point of cooking, if you ask me. You make enough for whoever shows up. By 7, the table was set Bianca's good plates, the ones from her wedding registry, the linen napkins she irons herself and reminds everyone that she irons herself. Rosa arrived, small and bright-eyed in a cardigan the color of dried roses, and she took my face in both her hands the way she has since I was a child and said, "There's my girl. You look tired, Soph." Which from my mother is the highest form of love, noticing. And for a moment, carrying platters to the table, steam rising off the roast, my mother settling into her chair, the whole room smelling like everything good I've ever cooked. For that one moment I thought, this was worth coming home for. Then we sat down. Then Marcus said grace, mostly about himself. Then plates started moving, and I reached to serve myself a second slice of the roast I had bought and butchered and cooked with my own 2 hands. And Bianca looked at my plate, and she looked at me, and in a voice pitched just loud enough to travel the whole table, light, amused, a little sing-song, the cruelest voice she owns because it lets her pretend she's joking, she said. "Maybe go easy there, Soph. It's just, you didn't exactly contribute a penny to any of this. Some of us actually paid for this dinner." The gravy spoon stopped in my hand. Rosa's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Marcus smirked into his wine. I set the spoon down very gently on the edge of the chipped blue bowl in the center of the table, our father's bowl, the only thing at that table older than any of us, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that my sister had no idea whose house she was sitting in. I want to tell you I said something devastating right then. I didn't. That's not how it works, not in real families, not when the person humiliating you is your own blood and your mother is sitting 3 feet away with her fork frozen in the air. What I actually did was smile. A small, stiff, terrible smile. I said, "You're right, Bianca, silly me." And I put my fork down and folded my hands in my lap like a scolded child, and I let the conversation move on, because the alternative was to detonate the evening my mother had been looking forward to for 2 weeks. Rosa tried to fix it, the way mothers do. "Bianca," she said quietly, "your sister made all of this." "I know she cooked, Mama." Bianca waved her wine glass. "I'm not talking about labor. Anyone can stir a pot. I'm talking about who actually provides for this family. There's a difference between doing a favor and carrying the weight, you know." She said it warmly. She smiled at me as she said it, like we were sharing a private and generous truth. "No shame in it, Soph. We all know things have been hard for you. Anyone can stir a pot." I have replayed that sentence more times than I can count. Not because it was the worst thing she said. It wasn't, not by a long way, not by the end. But because it told me exactly how my sister saw me. As a woman who could be useful but not counted. A pair of hands. A favor doer. Someone who helped but did not provide and therefore did not fully get a seat at the grown-ups' table of her own family. I got through the meal. I served the trifle. I complimented Bianca on her plates. God help me. And I drove home to the little house I was renting, or so my family believed, and I sat in my car in the dark driveway for a long time before I went inside. Here is the thing I kept circling back to, the small wrong note I couldn't stop pressing on like a bruise. It wasn't the insult. I'd survived worse from Bianca. We grew up in the same house, and she has always been like this. The pretty one, the loud one, the one who learned young that if she stated something confidently enough it became true. No. What snagged in me was a detail from earlier that evening, so small I'd almost missed it. When Rosa arrived, I'd helped her out of her coat, and a folded piece of paper had slipped from her cardigan pocket. I'd picked it up to hand it back, and my eyes, trained by 2 decades of reading invoices, had caught the top line before I could stop them. It was a bank letter. A second notice. Something about an account and a withdrawal authorization and a name that wasn't only my mother's. The name printed beside hers was Marcus. My mother had snatched it back, flustered, and stuffed it away and said, "Oh, that's nothing, just paperwork, you know how they send 1,000 letters." And I'd let it go because the roast needed carving. But sitting in that dark driveway, humiliated and quiet, I couldn't let it go anymore. My father died 11 years ago. Before he did, he sat me down, just me, not Bianca, because I was the one who understood money and he knew it. He handed me a set of responsibilities the way he handed me his recipes. Quietly, seriously, with the assumption I'd carry them without needing to be thanked. He said something to me that night that I've never forgotten. He put his big hand flat on the chipped blue serving bowl he'd eaten out of his whole life. The one that outlived him, the one that ended up in the center of Bianca's fancy table. And he said, "This bowl feeds whoever shows up, Sophia. Doesn't matter who paid. What matters is you always know who's really filling it." I didn't fully understand him then. I thought he meant something about generosity. Sitting in my car 11 years later, I was beginning to think he'd meant something a great deal more specific. Because here is what nobody at that table knew. Here is the thing that made Bianca's little speech about providing almost funny in a way I couldn't laugh at yet. I knew exactly who was really filling the bowl. It was me. It had been me for years. Let me back up, because you need to understand what my sister was actually saying when she told me I hadn't contributed a penny. You need to understand the size of it. When our father was alive, he ran a small commercial kitchen leasing operation, nothing glamorous, a couple of buildings on the industrial edge of town that he rented to caterers and food trucks and one long-suffering bakery. It threw off a modest, steady income. Boring money. Reliable money. The kind of money that doesn't make you rich but keeps a family standing. When he got sick, he did something that must have seemed strange to anyone who didn't know us. He didn't leave the business to Bianca, the daughter who lived in town, who was married, who had the big personality and the big house. He left it to me. He put the two buildings and the leasing company into a small entity and put me in control of it with one instruction given in that quiet, serious voice. Take care of your mother and don't let Bianca near the accounts. He loved Bianca. He also knew her. I was living 3 states away by then, building supply chains for other people. I ran our father's little operation from a distance for 11 years, collecting the rents, maintaining the buildings, keeping the books tight. And every single month, quietly, without announcement, I did what he asked. I took care of my mother, not with grand gestures. That's not how Rosa would have accepted it. I did it the invisible way. When her property taxes came due, they were paid before she saw the bill. She thought there was some senior exemption she didn't fully understand. When her roof needed replacing 4 years ago, a warranty she didn't remember buying covered it. Her medications, her supplemental insurance, the little cushion in her checking account that never quite ran dry no matter how much she gave away to church and grandchildren, that was me. Rooted through accounts and arrangements so that my proud, independent mother would never feel like a charity case, and so that Bianca would never, ever have a reason to come sniffing around the money our father had deliberately kept out of her reach. And there is one more thing, and this is the part that turns the whole evening into something else entirely. 2 years ago, Bianca and Marcus nearly lost their house. Their beautiful house, the one with the iron napkins and the wedding china and the good plates. Marcus's thriving business. He sold high-end fitness equipment through some multi-level arrangement he was always vague about, had thriving at itself into a great deal of debt. They were 3 months from foreclosure. Bianca called me, sobbing at 2 a.m, and swore me to secrecy. Don't tell Mama, don't tell anyone, I would die, Soph, I would just die, and asked for help. So I helped. Because that is apparently my role in this family, the one who helps. I didn't lend them money because I have watched what lending money does to families. Instead, quietly, through the same little entity our father left me, I bought the house. I purchased it from the bank, cleared the debt, and let Bianca and Marcus stay in it, paying me a rent so modest it was really just a fig leaf to preserve their dignity. On paper, to the world, it was still their house. In reality, it was mine. I owned every square foot of it, including the dining room, including the table, including the chair Bianca was sitting in when she told me I hadn't contributed a penny. She had forced herself to forget it. People are astonishing at rewriting the stories that shame them. Within a year, Bianca had reframed the whole rescue in her mind as some vague, family thing that worked out, and had gone back to being the successful sister, the provider, the one who hosted the proper dinners. Marcus had gone back to his vague thriving, and I had let them because their pride cost me nothing and my mother's peace was worth more to me than being right. That is the woman my sister told to stop eating. Now, here is where I have to introduce Marcus properly, because it was Marcus, in the end, who was the real danger, not to my pride, but to my mother. Marcus is charming in the way of a man who has never once in his life let charm work for free. Big laugh, big handshake, remembers your kids' names. But over those 6 months back home, I'd started noticing things that didn't sit right, small inconsistencies I kept mentally circling back to the way you tongue a sore tooth. Rosa had gone quiet in a new way. She used to call me to complain about Bianca. Now when I mentioned Bianca, she'd go careful and change the subject. She'd stopped going to her Thursday card game because, she said, Marcus is helping me with some things on those days. She'd started referring to Marcus as such a help with the finances, my mother, who did her own taxes with a pencil until she was 70. Twice, when I'd offered to look over her bank statements, she'd told me a little too quickly that Marcus had already sorted it. And now there was a bank letter in her cardigan pocket, a second notice, with Marcus's name printed beside hers on an account I had never authorized and knew nothing about. I sat in my dark driveway and I thought about my father's hand on that blue bowl. Always know who's really filling it. And I thought about the other half of that instruction, the half he gave me the night he handed me the keys to everything, the half I'd been too grief-stricken to fully hear at the time. Don't let Bianca near the accounts. He hadn't only meant our accounts. He'd meant her mother's, too. The next morning, I made 2 phone calls before I'd even finished my coffee. The first was to my mother, to tell her, in my warmest voice, that I'd love to take her to her Thursday card game myself this week. The second was to a very old friend from my restaurant supply days, a woman who spent her career following money through paperwork until it confessed. I told my family I hadn't contributed a penny. I decided it was time to show them exactly how much I had. The old friend's name is Priya, and for 15 years she was the person restaurant groups called when the numbers didn't add up, when a supplier was skimming, when a location was bleeding cash nobody could locate, when the money on paper and the money in the bank stopped telling the same story. She's a forensic accountant now, with her own small practice, and she once told me that money is the most honest thing in the world. People lie, she said. Ledgers don't. You just have to know how to make them talk. I met her for coffee 2 days after the dinner. I brought everything I could legitimately bring. My own records from the little leasing entity our father left me, the paperwork on the house I secretly owned, and the one thing I had that most people in my position wouldn't, the letter. Not the letter from Rose's pocket. I'd never seen that one again. But its cousin. Because here is a detail I hadn't mentioned to you yet, a detail that mattered enormously. When I bought Bianca and Marcus's house 2 years ago, part of the arrangement, the boring, invisible, chef supply chain part of me that dots every I, was that I'd set up an automatic system to monitor the property for any new liens or claims. It's standard when you own a building someone else lives in. You want to know if a tenant does something that could put your asset at risk. 3 weeks before that dinner, that system had flagged something. I'd glanced at it, assumed it was noise, and set it aside because Rose's checkup had run late that day and I was tired. It was a new financing claim connected to the property. A small one. I'd meant to look into it. I hadn't. Sitting across from Priya, I pulled it up on my phone and slid it across the table, and I watched her face do the thing it does, the stillness, the narrowing. Sophia, she said slowly, who's Marcus to your mother legally? Her son-in-law, nothing legal. Why? She turned the phone back toward me. Because this financing claim was taken out against equity in a property, and the cosigner isn't Bianca, it's your mother. Rosa co-signed a loan secured against a house she doesn't even own. She let that sit. A house you own, which means somebody told a lender your mother had an ownership interest she doesn't have, and used her signature and, I'd guess, her savings as collateral. Do you see the problem? I did. I saw it the way you see the edge of a cliff a half step before you reach it. That's fraud, I said. That's several kinds of fraud, Priya said. If it's what it looks like, but we don't know what it looks like yet. We know one thread. We need the whole cloth before you do anything, because if you go off half-loaded you'll tip him off, he'll clean it up, and your mother will be the one holding the bag. So, she took out a legal pad, an actual paper legal pad, and clicked her pen. Tell me everything. Start with the card game. I told her everything. The Thursday card game Rosa stopped attending because Marcus is helping with things. The bank letter, the second notice, in the cardigan pocket. The way my mother now flinched from the word Bianca, the such a help with the finances. The too quick, Marcus already sorted it. And that shift happened in me, right there at the coffee table, and I felt it happen. For 2 days I'd been a woman nursing a humiliation. A pair of hands that had been told they didn't count. Somewhere in the middle of that legal pad filling up with Priya's small, precise handwriting, I stopped being humiliated. I became something colder and far more useful. I became a woman with records access, a professional's instincts, and a very old set of keys, and a very good reason to use them. Here's what you can legitimately pull, Priya said, and here's what you can't touch, because if we do this, we do it clean, understand me. No hacking, no snooping in your mother's private mail, nothing that makes you the one who broke the rules. We win this in daylight or we don't win it. I nodded. What I could legitimately do, as the actual owner of that house, was request a full title report on my own property. What I could do, as the person Rosa had years ago named on a in case of emergency basis to speak with her utility and insurance companies, was verify accounts in my mother's name that I was authorized to verify. What I could do was take my mother to her card game and to lunch after and gently, without frightening her, ask her to show me the paperwork Marcus had been helping with as her daughter offering to help. "And if she won't show you?" Priya asked. "She'll show me," I said. "She trusts me." I paused. "That's the part that's going to break my heart, Priya." He counted on the fact that she trusts. He built the whole thing on it. Priya put her pen down. "Then let's make sure her trust turns out to be the smartest thing she ever did," she said, "not the thing that ruined her." The Thursday card game was the crack in the wall. I picked Rosa up early. She was thrilled, I could see it, the small girlish delight of being fetched, of being chosen. In the car, she chattered about the roast from Sunday, said Bianca hadn't meant anything by it, said I mustn't be sensitive. I let her. I wasn't there for Bianca. After her game, over grilled cheese at a diner she's loved for 40 years, I said, as lightly as I could, "Mama, I want to help you get organized. Just so I know where things are, in case you ever need me to step in for a day. Insurance, the house, that kind of thing. Would you show me?" And my mother, my proud, private, pencil and paper mother, looked at her plate and went very quiet, and then she said the thing that turned my cold determination into something with teeth. "I don't know if Marcus would like that," she said. "He said the less people involved, the safer it is for me. He said Bianca would only worry." The less people involved. He said Bianca would only worry. He wasn't just stealing from my mother. He was isolating her from the one person who could stop him, her own daughter, and he was doing it in the language of protection. He'd made her believe that keeping her family out was keeping her safe. I reached across the sticky diner table and took my mother's small, dry hand, and I said, "Mama, I'm not people. I'm your daughter. Whatever it is, I promise you it is safer with me in the room than out of it." She looked at me for a long moment, and then, God bless her, she opened her purse. What Rosa carried in her purse was not the whole picture, but it was enough to bring the whole picture into focus. There were 3 documents, soft with folding and refolding, the way papers get when someone reads them over and over trying to understand them. A loan agreement. A page of investment authorizations for something called a wellness equipment distribution fund, Marcus's business, dressed up in language designed to sound like a bank. And a schedule of monthly transfers out of my mother's savings account and into an account I recognized, because I'd seen its cousin 2 years ago when I quietly cleared Marcus's debts. It was one of Marcus's business accounts. My mother had been giving Marcus money every month for over a year. Not gifts. Investments. Investments he'd promised would grow her nest egg so she'd never be a burden on her girls. He'd taken her fear, the deepest fear of every proud old woman, the fear of becoming a burden, and he'd sold it back to her at a monthly rate. And when her savings had thinned to the point where the monthly transfers were getting hard to make, he'd solved that too. He'd had her co-sign a loan against equity in a house that wasn't hers, that she didn't understand she didn't own, so that the investment could continue. I photographed everything with Priya's rules ringing in my ears, daylight clean, only what you're authorized to see, and my mother had authorized me, right there, out loud in the diner. "Yes, Soph, look, please, I don't understand any of it. I've been so worried and I couldn't ask anyone." I couldn't ask anyone. My mother had been carrying this fear alone for a year because a man had convinced her that her family was the danger. I could have gone to the police right then. I could have gone to Bianca. I did neither because I remembered Priya's warning, tip him off and he'll clean it up and Rosa holds the bag. So I did something harder. I engineered a smaller confrontation first, one designed not to win the war, but to see who my sister really was. I invited Bianca to lunch. Just us. I did not lead with the fraud, I led with the house. "Bianca," I said once the drinks came, "I want to talk about the house." She stiffened. "What about the house?" "I want to talk about the fact that I own it, that I've owned it for 2 years. That I bought it out of foreclosure so you and Marcus wouldn't lose it, and that you've been paying me a token rent ever since, and that on Sunday, in the dining room of the house I own, you told me I hadn't contributed a penny to this family." I watched it hit her. I watched her face cycle through the whole ugly sequence, the flash of memory, the shame, and then, fastest of all, the reflex to make it not true. That reflex is the truest thing about my sister. That was a loan, she said. We're paying you back. You're paying me rent, Bianca, on your own house. That's not paying back a loan, that's a lease. But I didn't bring you here to argue about that. I leaned in. I brought you here because Marcus is stealing from Mama. And I need to know whether you're part of it, or whether you're a fool who's about to lose everything alongside her. Because it's one of the two, and your answer changes what I do next. Here is where the story could have gone 100 ways, and here is what my sister actually did. She didn't ask how much. She didn't ask, is Mama okay? She didn't ask to see the proof. She said, you've always been jealous of Marcus. She said, you couldn't keep your own marriage together, so you want to blow up mine. She said, voice climbing, other diners glancing over. You show up after being gone for a decade, and suddenly you know everything about my family. You always do this, Sophia. You play the martyr, the quiet saint. Oh, Sophia sacrifices so much, when really you just need to be the most important person in every room. Marcus said you'd try something like this. Marcus said you'd try something like this. There it was, the slip. She hadn't even noticed she'd said it, but it told me two things at once. That Marcus had already prepared her for the possibility that I'd come sniffing, which meant he knew there was something to sniff, and that my sister, when handed a choice between her mother and her husband, hadn't hesitated for even a second. I sat back. Something in me that had been clenched for years, some knot of hope that Bianca might, in a real crisis, be better than she'd ever been. It quietly untied itself and let go. It didn't hurt the way I expected. It just made everything very clear. Okay, I said. Thank you for answering my question. What question? Whether you were a fool or an accomplice, I said, and I put money on the table for both our lunches, because even then, God help me, I paid. I have my answer. You're a fool. Which is lucky for you, Bianca, because fools I can save. Accomplices I can't. I left her sitting there, and I drove to Priya's office, and I said, he's warned her about me. We have to move faster than I thought. Marcus moved first, which is exactly what desperate people do when they feel the ground shift. 2 days after my lunch with Bianca, Rosa called me, distressed. Marcus had come by to help her tidy her paperwork, and had gently, warmly, insistently collected all her documents to keep them safe in his fireproof box. The loan agreement, the authorizations, the transfer schedule. Gone, he was cleaning up. Just like Priya said he would. But here is the thing about a man who spent years believing everyone around him is slower than he is. He gets careless about the difference between hiding evidence and destroying it. Marcus took the papers out of my mother's purse. He could not take them out of the banks, the lenders, the county recorder's office, or the memory of the forensic accountant who now had photographs of every single one of them, time-stamped, before he ever knew I was looking. Priya spent that week making the ledgers talk. What she found was worse than either of us had guessed, and it was worse in a way that changed everything, because it meant my mother was not the only one. Marcus's wellness equipment distribution fund had a history. Priya followed the account structures, the same pattern, the same language, the same soft predatory rhythm, backward through 2 previous towns. In one, there'd been a retired school teacher. In another, a widowed uncle of one of Marcus's old business partners. Each one an older person, alone or lonely, isolated gently from their family, sold their own fear of being a burden, and drained slowly enough that no single month looked alarming. In one of those towns, there'd been a quiet settlement, money returned, papers signed, everyone agreeing to say nothing, because the family had been too ashamed to let it become public. Marcus wasn't a husband who'd made a bad investment. Marcus was a professional. My mother was not his first. She was just the one who'd made the mistake of having a daughter who read invoices for a living and owned the house he was leaning on. We found the school teacher. Her name was Alina, and she was 79, and when I called her carefully, gently, explaining who I was, there was a long silence, and then she said, "Is he doing it to someone else? Is he? Because they told me if I ever said anything, I'd only embarrass myself. My son made me sign a paper. I've been so ashamed." And she began to cry, and then she said, in a voice that steadied as she spoke, "What do you need from me? Tell me what you need. I don't want to be the last woman he does this to." I had my previous victim. I had my paper trail. I had a forensic accountant. I had the deed to the house in my own name. And I had one more thing Marcus didn't know I had, the thing my father had handed me 11 years ago along with his recipes and his warning. I had legal control, through the little entity, of the very equity Marcus had tried to borrow against. He had built the loan on a house he didn't own, secured by a person who didn't own it either. The whole scheme was standing on my property. It was standing on me, and I could pull the floor out any time I chose. But there was still my mother to think about. And here is where it got hard because Rosa still didn't fully believe it. That is the cruelest part of what men like Marcus do. They don't just steal money. They steal a person's ability to trust their own eyes. When I sat with my mother and Priya and laid it out, the transfers, the fake fund, the loan, the other victims, Rosa kept shaking her head, not in denial exactly, but in grief. "He was so kind to me," she kept saying. "He sat with me. Bianca is always so busy, but Marcus, he'd sit with me for an hour and just talk." And I understood, with a lurch, what Marcus had actually sold my mother. It wasn't investments. It was attention. It was the thing her own daughters, busy and far and self-absorbed, hadn't given her enough of. He'd found the exact shape of her loneliness and poured himself into it. "Mama," I said, and my voice cracked in a way I hadn't planned, "I am so sorry I wasn't here more. I am so sorry you were lonely enough that this worked. That's on me too, and I'll spend a long time being sorry for it. But being lonely is not a crime. What he did is. And I need you to be brave enough to look at it with me, because I cannot fix this without you." There was a long silence. My mother looked at the chipped blue bowl. I'd brought it home from Bianca's the night of the dinner, and it sat now on my counter, and she'd been staring at it the whole conversation. She put her hand flat on it, the exact gesture our father used to make. "Your father left you in charge," she said quietly, "because he knew. He knew Bianca, and he knew I'd get soft in my old age, and he knew you'd be the one to hold the line." She took a shaky breath. "All right, Sophia, show me how to be brave. What do we do?" Priya slid a folder across the table. Inside was everything, the whole cloth, finally, every thread pulled tight. "We invite the family to dinner," I said. "One more proper family dinner, at Bianca's house." I paused. "At my house. And this time, I tell them exactly how much I've contributed." I let Bianca think it was her idea. That was the only clever piece of theater in the whole thing, and I'm a little ashamed of how satisfying it was. I called her, warm as anything, and said I felt awful about how our lunch had gone, that I'd overreacted, that I missed my family and wanted to make peace. Would she host one more dinner? I'd cook, of course, my treat, a fresh start. Bianca, who could never resist being the gracious hostess forgiving her difficult sister, said yes before I finished asking. She even said, "I knew you'd come around, Soph." I let her have it. Let her set the good plates and iron the linen napkins she reminds everyone she irons herself. Let her believe she'd won. I arrived early to cook, the way I always do. I made the standing rib roast again, deliberately, the same meal, so that no one at that table could fail to understand that we were finishing what we'd started. I made the gravy that was too heavy for Marcus's cholesterol. I set the chipped blue bowl in the center of the table, where it belonged, where my father used to set it. And in my bag, in a plain folder, I carried the whole cloth. Priya waited in her car down the block with instructions to come in when I texted. Elena, the schoolteacher, sat beside her, wearing her good coat, 79 years old and steadier than any of us. I hadn't been sure she'd want to be there in person, but she'd said, "I've spent 2 years being ashamed in private. I'd like to be brave in public for once if you'll have me." I told her I'd have her gladly. We sat down. Marcus said grace, mostly about himself. Plates began to move. Rosa sat very straight, her hands folded, a woman rehearsing courage. And I waited until Marcus was mid-sentence, holding forth about some new opportunity in the wellness space, before I set down my fork and said, pleasantly, "Before we get too far into dinner, I'd like to clear something up from last time. Bianca, you said I hadn't contributed a penny to this family." I smiled. I've been thinking about that all month, and I decided you deserve a full accounting. It seems only fair. Bianca's fork paused. Soph, we're having a nice. You'll want to hear this, I said. All of you will. I did not raise my voice. That was the whole point. I had spent 41 years watching my sister win rooms by being the loudest thing in them, and I had learned somewhere along the way that the quietest person at the table, if she has the facts, cannot be shouted down. So I stayed quiet. I laid it out like a recipe, ingredient by ingredient. This house, I said, the one we're eating in, I own it. I have owned it for 2 years. I bought it out of foreclosure the night Bianca called me sobbing at 2 in the morning, and I've let you both live in it and save face ever since. I turned to Marcus. Which means the equity you borrowed against 3 weeks before that last dinner. You borrowed against a house that belongs to me, using my mother's signature. On a loan she didn't understand, for an investment fund that doesn't invest in anything. The color left Marcus's face in a way I will remember for the rest of my life. He set down his glass very carefully. That's a serious accusation to make at a dinner table, he said, and his voice was still smooth, still charming, reaching for the register that had worked on my mother for a year. Rosa's investments are perfectly. Rosa, I said gently, would you like to tell them what you told me? And my mother, 72 years old, in her cardigan the color of dried roses, the woman who'd been convinced her own family was the danger, put her hand flat on the chipped blue bowl, and she looked at Marcus, and she said the bravest thing I've ever heard her say. You told me not to tell my daughters, she said. You told me they'd only worry. You sat with me every Thursday and you took my card game and you took my savings and you told me it was so I wouldn't be a burden. Her voice shook and held. I trusted you, Marcus. I fed you at my table, and you were robbing me the whole time. Mama, Bianca started. Let me finish, Bianca. Rosa didn't look at her. Because you didn't listen either. Your sister came to you and you called her jealous. You chose him. In front of your own mother, you chose him. I texted Priya one word. Now, the doorbell rang. I got up and answered it in my own house, and I brought Priya and Alina into that dining room, and I watched Marcus's face when he saw the old school teacher walk in on her good coat and her steady legs. Hello, Marcus, Alina said. You probably don't remember me. I remember you. You called it a wellness fund with me, too. She sat down in the empty chair, uninvited, magnificent. I've brought copies of everything. I'm not ashamed anymore. I decided I'd rather be brave. Priya laid the folder open on the table, and she talked the way she talks, flat, precise, unhurried, letting the ledgers confess. The pattern across 3 towns, the fake fund, the forged interest in a house Marcus didn't own. My mother's savings, Alina's savings, the widowed uncle 2 towns back. Time-stamped photographs of every document Marcus had collected for safekeeping, taken before he'd ever known I was looking. Bianca stared at the papers, and I watched her whole world come apart, and I watched her, for the first time in her adult life, not reach for the reflex that made things not true. She couldn't. The papers were right in front of her. Her husband's name was on every one. Marcus, she said, in a voice I'd never heard from her, small and young and finally awake. Marcus, tell me she's wrong. He didn't, he couldn't. He stood up so fast his chair fell, and he looked at the door, and Priya said, without heat, You can leave if you want. It won't matter. The county recorder has copies. So does the lender. So does the fraud unit I filed with on Tuesday. Sitting down would look better for you, but honestly, Marcus, at this point, nothing's going to look good. He left. He actually walked out of the dinner and out of my house, and nobody stopped him, because there was nowhere left for him to walk to. And in the quiet after the door closed, my mother reached across the table and pulled the chipped blue bowl toward herself, and held it in both hands, and began, finally, to cry. The consequences came the way real consequences come, not all at once, not cinematically, but steadily over months, each one landing heavier than the last. The fraud referral Priya had filed became a real investigation once Alina and the widowed uncle's family came forward too. It turned out that a man who does the same crime in 3 towns eventually meets a prosecutor who can see the pattern. Marcus was charged. Because there were multiple victims, because there was a documented scheme, because there was a forensic accountant who'd built the case clean and airtight, there was no quiet settlement this time, no ashamed family agreeing to say nothing. It went on the record. It went in the local paper. The charming man with the big handshake became, in the eyes of the whole town, exactly what he was. The fake fund collapsed because it had never been anything but Marcus. His thriving business was revealed as an empty account with a predatory rhythm, and what money remained was clawed back toward the people he'd stolen it from. My mother recovered most of hers. Elena recovered some of hers, and told me it wasn't the money that healed her, it was watching him answer for it. "I got to be a witness instead of a secret," she said. "You gave me that." I told her she'd given it to herself. The loan against the house evaporated the moment the lender understood it had been secured with fraud against a property Marcus never owned. A property that, as it turned out, belonged to the very woman he'd been condescending to across the dinner table. I don't think anything gave me a colder, cleaner satisfaction than that. He'd tried to borrow against me. He never knew I was the floor under his whole scheme, and I simply let it drop. Bianca lost the most, in the way that people who choose wrong always do. She lost her husband, who took a plea and left her name attached to a scandal she'd have to live down in a town that loves to talk. She lost the story she'd told about herself, the successful sister, the provider, the one who carried the family. And for a while she lost me. I couldn't be near her, not right away. Some things need distance before they need forgiveness. But I didn't destroy her, though I could have. I still own the house. I could have put her out. I sat with that power for a long time, and then I did what my father would have done. I called Bianca, and I told her she could keep living there, at the same token rent, on one condition. She stopped pretending. No more ironed napkin performance of a life that wasn't hers. If she wanted to stay in my house, she'd have to live in it as what she was, my sister, whom I'd rescued twice now, once from a bank and once from a man, and who owed me not money but honesty. She cried on the phone. She said, "Why are you being kind to me? I told you not to eat." And I said, "Because Dad's bowl feeds whoever shows up, Bianca. Even you, especially you, but you're going to have to actually show up this time." The reconciliation, when it came, was not a sweeping, tearful reunion. My family isn't built that way, and I've learned to distrust the sudden ones anyway. It was slow. It was reserved. It was Bianca beginning to call me not when she needed something, but when she didn't. It was her showing up at Rose's on Thursdays to take her to the card game she'd stolen back from Marcus. It was, months later, Bianca standing in my kitchen while I cooked, not floating and touching nothing, but rolling up her sleeves and asking, quietly, "What can I do to help?" And meaning it, and me handing her a knife and a cutting board and saying, "Chop these, it matters. Anyone can stir a pot, right?" And both of us laughing, a little painfully, at the thing she'd once said to wound me. My mother is well. She does her own taxes again, with a pencil. She is not lonely anymore because I make sure of it. I moved into a house 10 minutes from hers, and I stopped hiding how much I do for her, because I finally understood that letting her know she was loved out loud was better than letting her feel like a burden in silence. That was the trap Marcus had found, after all. The silence. I don't do the silence anymore. The chipped blue bowl sits in the center of my mother's table now, where it should have been all along. Every Sunday it gets filled with something I've cooked, and it feeds whoever shows up. Sometimes that's Bianca. Sometimes it's Elena, who has become something like family. Always it's my mother who takes my face in both her hands and says, "There's my girl," and no longer tells me I look tired because I don't, not the way I did. My sister told me I hadn't contributed a penny. I never did give her the number. She doesn't need it now. She sits at my table in a house I own, eating food I made, beside a mother I protected, and she knows, finally, completely, without my ever having to say it again, exactly who's been filling the bowl all along.